People, kia ora nau mai, haere mai, welcome to a Tauiwi webinar today. And today we are very, very pleased to welcome Project Restore. So tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, we want to acknowledge all of you, the Indigenous people, the Indigenous lands where you're joining us from today, the Indigenous lands where we're broadcasting from. Today is the first webinar of 3, where Project Restore will support us to gain more knowledge about specialist restorative justice for sexual violence. I warmly welcome Tony, Fiona and Jennifer, who are our presenters for all 3 sessions. But before I do hand over for them to open more formally and introduce themselves and their project, I'm just going to go through a couple of housekeepings. The first is a reminder to all of those who don't usually talk about sexual violence that if any parts of the session do raise anything for you, that support is there, and in a second we'll share with you a link for Safe to Talk, which is our national helpline. And then for those who aren't familiar to Zoom webinars, I'll just do some virtual housekeeping. So you are all muted, which is normal in webinar sessions. But down below is the chat. So if you can find the chat function, which is a little speech bubble down below, you can start chatting with us, and would love to hear where you're from and who you are. So if you can find that chat button, go ahead and let us know. For asking questions, so the presentation and our presenters will tell us a bit more about how they're going to structure it, but ideally there's also a Q&A box, so if you can divert any questions to the Q&A box, we would love to hear from you and engage as much as possible in this presentation. So that is all from me. I will now hand it over in very competent and capable hands, and we really look forward to hearing more about this topic. So kia ora, Tony, I'll hand it over to you.
Kia ora, Miriam, thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa, e haere mai tēnei rā, tēnei hauki koutou ai tātou ai tua maha, nā kātua tangi, nā tātou katoa, aka ea ki te taha i a rātou, nō reira e hoa mā, our audience, no mai, haere mai. Ko Tony Lindquist, taku ingoa, greetings to all you today. My name is Tony. My background is one of probation or social welfare, really first, where I worked at Weymouth Girls' School. Did a long stint in probation before moving into Te Piriti, Sexual Offender Treatment Unit at Auckland Prison. Also, I'm a qualified counsellor. Spent 10 years working at Problem Gambling Foundation, and I do private practice, and joined Project Restore about 12 years ago. So I've been working with Project Restore for 12 years, working with offenders. My role at Project Restore, harmful sexual behaviour specialist. Yeah, that's about me. Kia ora.
Jennifer?
Kia ora, ko Jennifer Annan aho. I'm really pleased to be able to present on this webinar today. I come with a background of working with survivors of sexual harm and sexual violence. Began working in health in 2001 and worked on the crisis line with police call-outs and court support, and have been a founding member of Project Restore and supported developing safe practices for restorative justice for sexual harm. And as I was working at HELP, a critical question came up is how do we meet or confront the person that's harmed us, particularly as a child, and now we're adults. And so that led for me and a number of others, Catherine McPhillips, who was our clinical manager there and still is, working on, well, how to answer that question and how to develop a safe process. So I feel very proud of where we've come to today, and alongside people like Shirley Ulick as well, who have been incredibly passionate and drivers to support survivors getting their needs met. So I bring my experience from the last 15 to 20 years to this process today, and I'm really pleased to see on the list lots of people that I have engaged with over the years, and yeah, Fiona.
Welcome everybody. My name's Fiona Landon. I'm a restorative justice facilitator. I've been involved in restorative justice for 20 some years now, and with Jennifer and Catherine and Shirley and others, was a founding member of Project Restore, and still involved. My role in the organisation now is as a facilitator. And as we work together as a team, all three of the roles that you see here are the roles that work on our casework, which you'll hear more about as we go along. So welcome everybody, and I too recognise lots of names, and good to not see you, but know you're there. Okay, do you want to move on to the next slide?
I'm the slide keeper today, and I might need a bit of prompting from time to time from my team members.
So the first thing that we thought that we would talk about was what actually is restorative justice, and we've got a real mixed bag of people here today, and some may know some may know a lot, and some may know very little. So excuse us if we start from scratch, I guess, and attend to the basics so that we sort of make sure everybody gets a sense of what it's all about. There's lots of descriptions around restorative justice, but really it's a facilitated meeting for the most part. It's an opportunity for people to come together who've been harmed with the person that harmed them, to talk and share stories, and to have their needs met, the needs that arose as a result of the harmful behaviours. So they get to talk a bit about how come this all came about and why, and have some of those questions answered. And they get to share some of their stories about how it's been for them and the impacts that go wider out into their whānau and community. And then collectively to think about what needs to be done to address the harm. And there's a set of values that come along with restorative justice, and they're not too dissimilar from values that other sectors might be working with. Sometimes we use different names, but basically the values that we're working with are around the concept of, if you cause harm to somebody, then you need to do something about it, and you need to put things right as best you can. And that involves you taking responsibility, fronting up, and being willing and open to hearing about how your behaviour is impacted on others. It's a hopeful process, in that we hope that through the process of those conversations that people will get some healing and recovery, and assist them in moving on. It's respectful in that often we know that sexual harm and behaviour has been in the context of being disrespectful. So we're trying to bring the values of respect to all parties in the process.
Yeah, when I first looked at that slide, and it's important that we do hold values, and working with offenders, responsibility always stands out for me. It's like, if you can take responsibility. But the first word I was drawn to on that slide was forgiveness. And I thought, no, not forgiveness. But I guess it's important that it be there, but it's not the aim of Project Restore. It's not the aim of our restorative justice meetings is to offer forgiveness. It's a lot of offenders, they'll say, oh, I just want them to forgive me or whatever. I guess as a value, it plays a minor part in it, but it needs to be their responsibility. For me, from my perspective, it is the value that comes through to me, and the healing.
So when we're thinking about why would survivors want to engage in restorative justice, we look at the different options that there are in the criminal justice system for sexual harm. As widely known, and I'm sure most people on this webinar will know very well, that in terms of power and control, the criminal justice system in many ways replicates that sense of power and control, and the survivor doesn't have a lot of power or control in the criminal justice system. In my experience sitting with survivors over many years working at HELP as the court support person, I came to feel mortally ashamed of our criminal justice system and what it does to survivors, and giving evidence in court and making them feel like they're on trial. So that was very much behind a need for looking at a different way of being able to support survivors to get their needs met. And the restorative justice process supports self-determination, and we put the survivor in the driver's seat of the process. Criminal justice system is an offender-focused process and an adversarial, so it puts a wedge between the parties, whereas restorative justice is much more relational and can help to support them to get understanding for why each other would have acted in the way they did. Often we've had cases that we're sitting with both parties saying, well, why did this happen? If only they had come to us in the beginning and we would have been able to talk this through, and been told by lawyers not to talk with the other side, and the police telling them not to talk with the harm doer's side, which creates the wedge that gets bigger and bigger as time goes by. So a lot of the restorative processes that are pre-sentence are helping to get each other to understand what's been happening with the survivor's interests at heart. So it supports direct relationship with people to come together to talk.
And just a note on that too, Jennifer, the criminal justice system is around laws and laws that have been broken. And it's a set of rules that determine how you address those laws that have been broken. Whereas restorative justice's focus is on need and harm. What are the needs that have arisen as a result of what happened? What needs to be done to address the harm? And what are the things that we need to do to allow everybody to move forward with their lives? So the focus is very different.
And you know what it does? It takes the power away from the system and puts it in the hands of the participant. The person that's been harmed and the person that did the harm gives them a chance to determine how they're going to move on with their lives rather than the system deciding.
And which is a really exciting part of being involved in this process. And a question that often gets asked is, why on earth would anybody want to meet with the person that harmed them? And it's important to know that it's not for everyone, that it's a very carefully, and we'll talk about this later in a few slides away, that it's a careful assessment of each case by case. So for those who are keen and feel it's going to be helpful, and we assess that it's going to be helpful and useful and safe, then it can have some really good outcomes, which we'll talk about as well.
Okay. So we touched on a little bit around how Project Restore came about, and I guess key to that was what was being alluded to, in that there's a dissatisfaction with the current system and an interest in looking for other ways. So when we set Project Restore up, we thought we weren't just thinking about as an add-on to the criminal justice system. We were also thinking of the process as an alternative for those that didn't wish to engage in the criminal justice system. And of course, as we know, the vast majority of people don't. So that's been our emphasis from the beginning. And I guess what came about was people from the restorative justice sector, people from the sexual violence sector, people from the family violence sector, researchers in restorative justice and sexual violence, and others came together and thought, what is it that we could do that would create a system that was going to meet the needs of survivors? And our thinking was based on research that had been done around restorative justice and sexual violence in New Zealand by Dr. Shirley Ulich, by others, and by the experiences of the people working in the sector. And we started thinking about the model of restorative justice and whether or not that was a model that would work in this situation. And we came to the conclusion that the current model of restorative justice in its limited form wouldn't be a model that would work, but we could adapt that model and make it work with the knowledge and skills of the people in the sector, sexual violence sector. So one of the key points was engaging with the sector that we were designing a process for. And that's a point of difference in the way restorative justice has been rolled out in New Zealand and other sectors. For example, the family violence sector. One of the reasons we didn't initially start doing restorative justice and family violence was because we didn't have the family violence sector buy-in at that time. So we thought, we've got sexual violence sector buy-in, let's work with that, see what we can do, and maybe this process and our model might work for family violence. And over the years, we've started doing cases where there's both sexual and family violence dynamics, and we've found that it does work for family violence cases as well. But the key point of difference with restorative justice for sexual harm compared to other standard restorative justice processes, I always use the train analogy to explain it. So imagining that we're standing at a train station, and in this, the standard RJ train comes into the station, and the restorative justice facilitators are saying, this is the restorative justice process. Do you want to engage in this or not? And you either choose to step on the train or not. And the train has a set destination where it stops and everybody gets off. With sexual harm, one of the things that was important to us was the amount of survivor control over the process. So our specialists sit alongside the participants on the train station. And where do you want to sit in the carriage? And who do you want to be there with you? And how far along the track do you want to go to meet your needs? So it's a much more tailored and co-designed process with the participants and in a way of addressing their needs.
So the three-legged stool, I love this metaphor. Project Restore, as opposed to other restorative justice providers, operates on a three-legged stool model, and even in our presentation today, there's the three of us, and the three of us work together closely when we're doing a case. Another beauty of this stool model is that it's research-based, that research proves that it's really effective. And you can see, you take away one of the legs, that stool's not stable. It needs the three legs to be stable. And what that means is the offender specialist, the survivor specialist, and the facilitator, the three people are working closely together the whole time in this process. And as I looked at the stool, and I thought if we could put some bits of dowel just down the bottom to strengthen it, that's what we do. We talk a lot with each other. We meet every week. We go back. We go and meet with all the clients at different stages during the process, during the assessment process, to make sure that we've got a solid foundation to be able to go. Because when we're talking about sexual harm, it's really important to get it right and to be open as you go into a conference. Anything to add to that, girls?
And Tony, one of the things that I hear you often say when you meet the survivor, which is at some point during the process, is that you're there to support the person that's done the harm to do the best job that they can for the needs, to meet the needs of the survivor. And I've always really enjoyed when you've said that, because again, it brings the survivor back into the centre of the process, and that we're all working with that person's needs at the centre.
Often when I meet the person that's caused the harm, what I'll say to them, I'm not here to support you, but I'm here to support the truth. I'm here to support you to be as honest as possible, and you will benefit from that. Because if the offender can take responsibility, if the person that caused the harm can put his hand up and what I call manning up to it, then the survivor's going to benefit from that.
So the next slide talks about the types of referrals that we might receive. So there's the cases that have never entered and never will enter the criminal justice system, and therefore it's an alternative justice model. There's cases that have where people have reported and charges may or may not be about to be laid, and the police recognise that perhaps the court would, that the process, if it went through the court, wasn't going to get the outcomes that everybody wanted, or perhaps they couldn't move it forward, but they could see that there would be some benefit from some dialogue between the parties. So those are called pre-charge referrals. And then the most common referral we receive is pre-sentence. So that's cases where...
would diversion be part of a pre-charge? Would that come into pre-charge?
Yeah, that would be right. And then, yep.
Sorry, and I was going to say for Jennifer, we're doing more work with not quite diversion, but to save it going to court. What are those ones called?
So
they're in the pre-charge
cases, and the pre-charge cases are complex because one of the questions I note is if the harm doer denies the offending. As soon as it goes into a police process, often the person that's accused and alleged to have done the harm will get advice from their lawyer and generally be advised not to say anything in terms of supporting their well-being through the court process. So as soon as it goes into the police process, it creates difficulty in terms of having somebody be upfront and honest and genuine because of the fear of what might happen in the police process. So very few of the pre-charge cases that we've dealt with have actually proceeded. It requires somebody that's got a high level of taking responsibility to engage at that time. And it would only happen if the survivor was saying, well, actually, I don't want to go through the police process. I prefer this option. And then we can divert it off.
Yeah. And so the most of our referrals come through in the pre-sentence space. So that is after someone has pled guilty before they're sentenced. Occasionally we get referrals where someone has been found guilty and the victim has asked for restorative justice, but mostly those cases don't proceed. And we have to be very careful in those situations that it's something that the victim is driving rather than the offender is driving after they've been found guilty to get another tick on their box in terms of their sentencing. Post-sentence, we do a lot of work post-sentence where sometimes it just isn't the right time for restorative justice in the limited time frame that we have in pre-sentence. So sometimes people need to do a bit more treatment or a bit more therapy before they're ready to engage, and we suggest that we have the conference after sentencing, so the court process is over and done with, and we can then take our time to do the process in their time frame.
And that often sits with family violence cases where pre-sentence is ways too early in terms of needing to engage the harmful behaviour, needs to engage in programs to really understand and stop being angry. Often that first stage in the cases that we get tend to be the higher level ones, and often they are in custody and in waiting sentence, and they're sitting there boiling, so it's not a good time to be proceeding with a restorative justice process.
And then sometimes pre-release, and that's actually a really opportune time because it's a time where someone has been sentenced to rather a long sentence or not even long, and the anxiety level rises when the victim or survivor knows that the person is about to be released, and they've got lots of concerns and worries. And so it's a good time for them to re-engage and find out where the offender or the person who caused the harm is at that point. Hopefully they will have done some treatment in prison and they've got a better understanding of their the causes of their offending, although not always the case. And then, of course, after someone's released, there might, further down the line somewhere, there might be a time where someone wishes is ready to do the work that they weren't perhaps ready to when it was offered to them earlier.
We also get in a few referrals, not many, from people that have caused the harm, some that have been convicted, some that haven't been convicted. It's a very difficult process for us to go very further because it means finding a safe way to contact the survivor to see if they're interested. So if we don't have a safe way of contacting the person that's been harmed, then there's little we can do with that. We can't take them much further.
Yeah. Okay. Jennifer,
this slide here is just a sense of the holding our people really carefully. And I thought also it would be a good one to answer the question that I noticed come up as the age group. of people that we work with. We cover a whole spectrum of the ages, and when we first started, we decided that we wouldn't work with children because we didn't feel like we had the expertise to do that or the knowledge. But as we've gone along, we've found that the children at various ages are asking to be involved. Some, not all, but some. And so we have done work with ages from 8 upwards. Generally below that we haven't. I think the youngest person actually I worked with was 6. And that was a very carefully monitored and constructed and tailored process with the parents, the grandparents, and to ensure that there was a really safe process for the children, and that they would be only involved in a very small part of the process with very protective adults to support them. So yes, answering that question, we have developed ways of working with all age groups. Often for the children, it's the parents that are being, or the protective adult that represents them in the restorative process.
And just also noting on that we liaise with child therapists working with children in terms of the preparation and support in the process and afterwards, and take their advice as to whether it might be or might not be appropriate for this particular person.
Absolutely.
Child.
So safety is paramount when we're working with all people, and particularly vulnerable children. So then we come to the opportunities for survivors, and as I said earlier, there's always the question that meets me is, why on earth would anybody want to meet with a person that sexually abused them? And in terms of the opportunities, as we've unpacked that with many places, many survivors, the list on the screen, and I'm not going to go through them one by one, but it gives you an idea of some of the thoughts and feelings and experiences that people have said that this is helpful for. So as we developed in Project Restore, there was a sense of survivors asking for this process, and for me personally, not knowing what process was going to be helpful, and then finding restorative justice actually became a really helpful structure to safely meet with the person that's done harm. As we've processed the restorative justice meetings, survivors often come out and say things like, I feel so much lighter. There's a huge weight that's been lifted off my shoulder, and after all of these years, I can finally breathe. So that's a group of people that are that have experienced sexual abuse as children and are now as adults, and have generally done significant amount of counselling and got a sense of themselves. It helps as they've gone through that process. What I've noticed is, and we'll unpack this more in the next session that's focusing on survivors, there's a real sense of speeding up their healing and recovery journey, which really excites me, and part of my passion for the work is to support survivors to be able to move forward into their lives in a way that they can thrive, and with them in the driver's seat. So again, as opposed to the criminal justice system where they're not, this puts them in the centre of the process, and we work creatively to figure out how to meet their needs. So part of the assessment is, what are your needs, and being able to assess whether they can be met. And there's quite an in-depth, and we'll talk about that shortly. Anything you both want to add?
Just the concept of giving a realistic picture of what they might expect in terms of the offender's ability to front up and take responsibility. We're very open and transparent in our communication between the parties. We don't share what other people have said, but we do share our impression, and that helps survivors. And what I often hear Jennifer say to survivors is, what do you think we'll see when, you know this person, what do you think we'll see when we meet with them? And then when we come back and we tell them about our experience of the person, they're like, that it's really validating for them that we have seen and not been manipulated or tricked by the offender into seeing something other than what their experience of the person is. And it helps settle them for the process, and helps them not have unrealistic expectations of what's possible. And people don't change overnight. It's a slow process, and so often the offender is not on the continuum of responsibility taking, isn't necessarily right down the other end. They're still on a journey. So long as they're on that journey and moving, that's what's important. And important that they're not going to say or do anything that's going to cause any further harm through coming together.
One of my observations, during the time that I've worked there is that why me? It's one of the strongest motivators for survivors wanting to go to conference, and it's often one of the hardest things to get out of offenders, because we're not there to do the treatment with the offenders, we're there to prepare them for restorative justice process. So being able to answer that why me and dig a little deeper is really important for survivors to know. And I guess also on that point, that survivors have felt so guilty when they haven't disclosed early on in their life, and then someone else has gone on to abused, and the guilt and the distress they feel because they didn't disclose. So it's a really important question that we attend to.
And a delicate dance there to support survivors to acknowledge and hold that sense of wishing that they had done something earlier, against, well, actually, when you're in this complex grooming situation, it's really hard to have done that. And so it's really important that we have the skills to be able to hold a person with both parts of that. Yeah.
So opportunities for offenders, and I guess that take responsibility I mentioned before should be right at the top. But many people that cause the harm will say, oh, if I could only turn back the clock, particularly if they're taking a high degree of responsibility. But you can't turn back the clock. You can't undo what's already been done. But the next best thing is giving the gift of taking responsibility, because that allows the survivor to take a load off their back. So that's the most important thing. That's what I work on to a high degree, is for the person to take a or the person that caused the harm, the offender, to take a high degree of responsibility. And I always see that as a continuum. As kind of some offenders, when I first worked with them, say, well, I pleaded guilty, didn't I? And kind of pleading guilty is not enough in itself. It may be 20% on the continuum. And what I'm working to do with the person is take them up to as high a degree of responsibility as possible. So it's also an opportunity for the person that caused the harm to find out why they did it. Like I said, many people don't know. When I say, why did you do this? Oh, I don't know. It's like, well, what was your intention? And so we explore that, and I guess I give them an introduction into what treatment may be like to help them understand, because if they don't know why they did it, if they don't know how they did it, how are you going to reduce the risk of it happening in the future? Sexual offenders also lead quite an isolated life, many of them, and it's to be able to get supports in place. We won't do a restorative justice meeting unless both parties have support. So it's helping reconnect the person into a community of support, so that they're not feeling so alone. The more isolated, again, the higher the risk of further offending. And as we get into the meeting, it's an opportunity for the person that caused the harm, the offender, to understand the impacts, to increase empathy for other people. A lot of people that cause sexual harm are right in their own heads. They struggle to imagine what it's like for someone else. And as we do our work with them, we can do a little bit of victim empathy work. And as the survivor talks about the impacts on her during the restorative justice meeting, then this person starts to understand. And just a brief story that really impacted on me, that we did a restorative justice process, and the survivor was telling her story about the harm. And she said, you know, this happened, I think it was 40 years ago, and now every time I go to a dentist and the dentist says open up, she says I just freeze. I just go back and I get chills through my spine when I think about what you made me do. So, and when the offender heard this, he broke into sobbing. He just had no idea of how this had continued to impact on her life. And moving to the final one, addressing safety concerns. It's all about going back into the community with a plan, with a way of keeping yourself safe, with a way of helping reduce the risk of harming other people.
Thank you, Tony. So just the types of processes offered, and this goes back to that train analogy. We aren't just offering a face-to-face victim-offender conference. Often the person, the non-offending parent and the victim's relationship, if it's childhood sexual abuse, has been caused a rift and damage to that relationship. And in order to allow that non-offending person to fully support the victim or the survivor in the process, we need to facilitate meetings between them to bring them closer together. Where a face-to-face meeting is just something that they can't do, but they have information they want and to give and receive, then shuttle mediation, where we're taking bits of information backwards and forwards, is really helpful. For some people, they don't want to invest the time and energy into a restorative justice process, but they want the person held to account by the wider community, and a community panel process where they're represented might work for them. Then we've got the more common face-to-face meeting where the person that's harmed, the person causing the harm, and support people and our team are present. And then sometimes we're also facilitating meetings between organisations and victims, where the victim feels that the organisation has some responsibility for not keeping themselves safe. So that would be churches, schools, community social service organisations, in workplaces, where the way that people have responded to the harm and or not protected people is something that the survivor or the victim feels they need to address. So just aware of the time, guys. We just need to move through the next bits quite quickly.
So we've talked about a number of things as we've gone along already. So the stages of assessment and preparation are really in depth. The initial contact with the survivor and the person that's done harm is about building relationship and rapport and beginning to understand the survivor needs and the offender's willingness and openness to engage in the process. And if they are, and if it feels like it's going to be a useful process, we then go into a pre-conference assessment and preparation phase, which can be anything from 1 or 2 sessions to sometimes many, many more, depending on what's needed in any one case. And the assessment is the when, so I see it like a marathon. Everybody's training for this marathon to get to the healing and recovery that's needed. And some people will be stronger in their capacity than others. And that sometimes that might be the survivors kind of move through the stage 3 of, for those who understand the Judith Herman 3-stage healing process. Stage 3 is coming out and being ready to re-engage with the world with good capacity, a good sense of self. That's a great time to be doing the restorative justice process. So we're assessing each party to see if we need to park someone or and allow the other person to do some more work, and realistically feeding back to each party about where we're at so that we can keep people on board throughout the process. The thing that is really important to the whole process is the fact that it's a voluntary process, and that is often the thing that helps to hold people in when it's getting hard, because it's like a roller coaster. And when it's really hard, knowing that actually you don't have to do it, and taking a breath with that and taking some time. Sometimes people take a couple of minutes or a week or months to sit back and think, oh, is this something I want to do? Then when they come back, they're coming back because they want to do it. So again, they're in the driver's seat of that process. Tony, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just the safety aspect, you know, we talk about it has to be a safe process before we go to the final step, the face-to-face meeting. In most cases, then we need to make sure that everyone will be emotionally safe during that meeting, and that's really important.
And the follow-up and monitoring is also very important.
Yeah. Sorry, Fiona, I was just going to say that we're going to go into more detail in the next couple of webinars. So we're just giving you a real light once over here. So you may have questions that will be answered in the next 2 webinars as well.
Cool. So should we move on to the conference process? Yeah. So it's basically 3 stages in a facilitated meeting or any form of meeting, restorative meeting that we have. And the first stage is looking at what happened and why it happened, an opportunity for survivors' questions to be asked, for the offender or the person who caused the harm to take responsibility and demonstrate that and the learnings that they've had. And then we move to the next part, which is an opportunity for people who've been harmed to share how it's been for them and some of the ripple effects. It's an opportunity for the person who caused the harm to then respond to that, which is when you would normally expect an apology, if someone wished to receive and wish someone to give an apology. And it also helps the survivor get an understanding of the support systems around the person that caused the harm and what they think and feel to make. They often worry about whether the person's been fully honest about what they've done, and it's good for them to hear from the person who's harmed, support people about what they've think and have noticed in the person. And then the last bit of the meeting is around what are the things that need to be done to address the harm that arose as a result of what happened, and what is the person who caused the harm willing to do. And we talk about a variety of things that we cover in terms of future contact, in terms of treatment, in terms of safety planning. We talk about reparation. We talk about anything that the survivor feels would be helpful for them in order to assist them in terms of moving on from what happened. And then just a closing round of last words that anyone wants to say. And the meeting can be anything from 2 to 3 hours to 5 or so hours. We have lots of breaks along the way. So we set aside the whole day and we spend as much time as we need to with as much breaks as we need to along the way. Tony.
I just this slide always reminds me of how important it is to collaborate between ourselves first and foremost. We have a high degree of transparency and collaboration and sharing everything that's happening with our clients so that we can get the best for them, so that expectations are realistic, so that we know it's going to be a safe process to go ahead. I just wanted to start with that.
And I just want to add, in terms of sharing with clients, we only share with clients with consent of each of those clients to pass information on between one and another, and we'll talk more about that in webinar 2 for the survivor side. But it's you just wanted to clarify that anything that we share before conference is with consent.
So collaboration from working with the person that caused the harm, the offender, collaboration with lawyers, not always our best friends because they want the best for their client and the system. We want the best emotionally from their client. Those two things don't always meet. Collaboration with probation, letting them know that we're have an intervention going on. Collaboration with people like SAFE or Te Piriti or any treatment or counsellors. So as harmful sexual behaviour specialist, I like to collaborate with everyone else that's involved in the person's life at the time.
And from the survivor specialist side, we do the same with the police, Crown prosecutors and counsellors and sexual violence agencies. So there's a lot of our work is in terms of care and trauma care to ensure that the safety, the emotional safety and the physical safety for the survivor is paramount. And so we talk about a team and netting the survivor in the centre.
And I guess from the cultural aspect, there's more collaboration with whānau members, with Pacifica members, because they tend to work in a bigger whānau concept than Europeans.
Absolutely, and in Māori as well. So tikanga Māori processes and certainly having a whānau-centric approach and working from where they're at and checking that out carefully.
So it's not the silver bullet. It's not for everyone. It's about when. Sometimes not about if. It's about how. So we're adapting and tailoring and pacing and offering options, and people can come back to us in the future if it isn't the right time when it's offered. So and it may never be the right time. It isn't for everybody. So we are very careful about making sure that we have informed consent, that people are choosing and are choosing for all the right reasons. They're not being pressure put on them to engage in the restorative justice process. And we recognise that it's not a replacement for therapy, either for the survivor or the person harmed or the person causing harm. We actually believe that it enhances both of those things, in particular with offenders in terms of their engaging in treatment and their motivation for treatment. But it also, in our experience, has moved people along their healing and recovery journeys faster than perhaps they would have done without restorative justice for some. So those are all things that I think are really important to be aware of, that it's not for everyone and not now for everyone, but could be at some point in the future. So we've sort of come to an end. Do you want to move? We've run a little over time, but we're very keen to answer any questions that anyone has. So happy to hear from Miriam around some of what those questions are.
Kia ora koutou, thank you so much. That was such an in-depth presentation. I was busy taking notes for myself, and really, I really enjoyed the value of the relational space over and the restoration of well-being for both, which came across really strongly as part of your process. So thank you very much. There's a lot of questions coming through, so I've been doing a bit of work in collating them so that we can get through as many as possible. So the first kind of series of questions that I'm going to try and bunch up is really about the introduction to restorative justice. And so there's a question around how does restorative justice align with tikanga Māori practices, which you touched on, and wondering if you can go a little bit deeper. And connected to that in terms of culture is also, are you aware of any restorative justice processes for Pacific communities, and could you talk a little bit about that?
Tony, do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess my understanding of restorative justice is it is an old cultural practice, and there's not just for Māori but Pacifica, and I've seen instances of when someone's been harmed in, say, in a Samoan setting in a village in Samoa, that they will go to the family that's been harmed and ask what needs to be done to right the wrong, sort of thing. So I think our restorative justice, I don't know much about where it came from, but I know it has cultural concepts from way back before there was a justice system, well, a westernised justice system.
And as we've talked about our process in terms of being very whānau-centric, it fits nicely with some of the Pacifica and Māori cultural ways of addressing harm within whānau and wider iwi and hapu groups. And we work very closely with providers and people that are working with our clients to adapt the process to meet their cultural needs wherever possible. So we have processes on marae. We take follow the lead of other organisations in their work with them and try and fit in our piece of work in amongst the context of the support that the people are receiving from the organisations that they're receiving from. Jennifer, you want to add anything?
Can I just...
Yes,
try and do is get the two kaupapas to work together. So, we think the format, the kaupapa of Project Restore is really important, the way we hold it. But we also hold that Māori and Pacifica kaupapas are really important as well. And so in working towards the final product, we're working closely with consultants or people on the marae or whānau members that play a big part, kuias and kaumatuas, and we work closely beside them so that both things can work together.
And I think the tailor-making the process to meet the needs of the survivor supports that to happen. So whatever it's going to be important for that that person is where we will take the lead from. But I also just want to, like, the Restorative Justice Best Practice Framework, that the values that sit there sit really nicely with Māori as well in terms of tika. We do things the right way. In pono, we're truthful and honest and sincere in our interactions with people, and whanaungatanga in terms of relationship building, ahurangatanga in terms of warmth and safety of place to provide a manaakitanga, and manamatu haki in terms of self-determination, so the survivor being in the driver's seat, and also acknowledging the person that's done harm needs to be able to be in charge of their process, and araha. So there's a really nice connection of values that we sit with Project Restore that align with the Restorative Justice Best Practice Framework. And the work that we've done with Māori and Pacifica have been quite, my experience of them has been that they have been collaborative and be really useful to be doing more partnering with Māori, and that's something that we've certainly got on our agenda to figure our way forward with that. So it's a work in progress for Project Restore, which I look forward to.
And we do know of other organisations doing work in this space, and sometimes we're doing a little piece of that work, not the whole of the piece of the work. We've had other cultures as well that have done a cultural practice, but that hasn't quite hit the mark. And then we've come and added something to what's already done. So that's not taking away the value of that. That's adding to and building together all the pieces of the puzzle of that person's needs, cultural, emotional, whatever needs they might have.
Thank you for that answer, very in-depth. There's just a very quick, a lot of questions that came through actually throughout the whole session is, will the slides be made available and will we be recording this? So I can say we are recording this and it will be available. Will we allow the slides to be available too?
Yeah.
Nice and easy, nice and quick question. I thought we'll just get that out of the way. The next series of questions is all about the appropriateness of going through with, like, how do you assess if restorative justice is appropriate for certain people and can it cause more harm? So the key points in there are, can the process go ahead if the person that has done harm denies that the harm they caused? Can it cause further re-traumatization for survivors? And how do you assess if it's an appropriate process or not? And you might want to some of the questions join the next webinars, or
we will. We absolutely will. I'll jump in quickly, Jennifer, and then leave you. Denial. If someone absolutely denies doing what they did, then there's no restorative justice process that can occur. That's not to say that we haven't had lots of survivors want to have a process where they accuse the person and then they don't really care whether they're denying it. They want to tell them what they think and feel about what happened. But we wouldn't call that restorative justice. So sometimes we have situations where the stories are a bit different, but there's some benefit in each other hearing each other's stories and the hope that they might be moved towards some responsibility taking. So we've had a couple of cases where we have allowed each party to share their story about what happened, and then through that sharing of the stories there's been a shift that's occurred, which has then allowed us to move into a restorative process where someone's taking responsibility for causing some harm. it's not black and white. There's a continuum, there's a lot of greys, but you know, there is a requirement when you're entering in restorative justice for someone to acknowledge that they've caused harm. Otherwise, it isn't going to be restorative and could re-traumatise a person who's been harmed. Jennifer.
And some of those cases are around, we're looking for the harm. Does the person that has been accused of the harm acknowledge that although they may not have intended to harm, that the person felt harmed? So where there's a maybe a relationship situation where she said no and he said, well, I didn't hear you say no. That's a very common one. There's not the intention to harm, but there is the harm done, and which is real. And if the person that's done the harm unintentionally is willing to engage in that process, then that can be quite a relational conversation and helpful. But if they're sitting saying, no, it didn't happen, and yes, I didn't want to harm them, but it absolutely didn't happen, which is a case that we had not so long ago, a pre-trial case, then it's not something that's safe for the survivor to be sitting with. They're already going through a process of saying this is what happened, and then to have the person saying, well, it didn't happen, is re-traumatizing, and so we wouldn't. So it brings to mind every case needs to be assessed on its own merits and with a whole lot of complexities, which we'll go into a little bit more in stage 2 and 3 webinar.
Yeah, the assessment process is very thorough, and we'll go into a lot more depth in the assessment process in the coming webinars.
Right, so thank you for that, and I really encourage those who do want more information to attend all the other webinars, and I'll just reshare in the chat in a second the link to be able to register for the next one, which is on the 15th of May. The next series of questions is about like how you work with the system. So some of the questions are, do you have the ability to stop it going through the courts? And you did answer a lot of that in terms of the process of it, can it be pre-trial, post-trial? But one of them was, do you have the ability to stop it go through courts? For those communities who don't want to press charges, but they are offenders that have offended repeatedly, and the community doesn't want their own sent to prison but want accountability and change, would you work with those cases? And connected to that is around when you are working with the system, does collaboration mean that you have access to information such as court documents, police summary of facts, evidence, etc.? So kind of there's a few elements in there, but they linked in quite well together. So it's like
I'll start briefly, and then I think Jennifer will probably add. So yes, we have access to all the information that we generally need, and we always ask for more information if we don't have it. So we get victim impact statements, summary facts. We sometimes, with permission, get access to transcripts of interviews of the survivor in particular. And we have no power to advise to exit the criminal justice system. Other people make those decisions, but we do provide information that might allow those decisions to be made. And there have been a couple of cases where the judge has diverted the process to us to see if a restorative process can occur, and then gone back to the court and the charges have been dropped and the case has been closed. So that has happened on rare occasions. Yes, we can have processes where communities hold people to account in creative ways without engaging in the criminal justice system. Safety is always the most important decision. If there's current risk of safety, such as a child in the home or having access to an adult offender, then of course that's not a safe situation to be engaging in a restorative justice process. The safety needs need to be attended to first. But where there isn't a current safety risk, and there's that need for greater accountability in a community, then an alternative process could be a good option. Anything you want to add to that, Jennifer?
No, I think you covered it fairly well. It's, again, always coming back to what the survivor needs and how is it going to be helpful for them, and is whatever process that's being suggested by whoever going to be helpful or re-traumatizing and re-victimizing. So those are the kind of coat hangers that we have as how is it going to be for the survivor.
And I don't know whether, did we talk about
there's an interesting
the conference is taped and
Tony,
the judge gets a copy of the tape? Did you say that?
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if we did, but we do. So we record the meeting, and our reports are very thorough with a word-by-word account of what was discussed in the meeting for the most part, except for the discussion around outcomes, which we summarise, which is very different from the reports that would normally be given to the court. Our reports are 20, 30, 40 pages long sometimes, with a lot of dialogue in them for the judges to get a really good sense of what's happened in the process. And I just had another thought, but it's skipped my mind. We've done an interesting process around accountability groups. So what we've noticed in particular with young people, that they've started to form accountability groups to hold their peers to account, and they might be in shared communities of some particular type, music, sexual preference, like all sorts of different shared communities which people engage in, where there's been behaviour that's been considered unacceptable by the group and that they have sought to address. And sometimes the people that have been affected aren't necessarily wanting to engage, but they have been happy for this accountability group to take over that responsibility and hold the person to account. And it's been an interesting adaptation and journey. And what we learnt from that was that often when people are in those situations, they don't really know what they're doing and they're a bit lost, and they let themselves into something that's way beyond what they've thought that they were letting themselves in for. And so they've been extremely grateful for us to come along and sort of finish off what they've started in terms of bringing it all together, and that's been really helpful. So there's other kind of sort of more community interventions that we've been part of that wouldn't necessarily fit the criteria of a victim and offender process.
Yeah, no, I'm just mindful of time, and there's a couple of questions that I can see on the screen, Miriam, that I thought I might just quickly answer because they seem to be important ones. One is, how can you do a referral? So at the moment, the best way to do that, if you're a community referral, is to go to our website, and there's an inquiry section there that you can send an inquiry to, and then one of our survivor specialists will make contact with you. The other is there it's just disappeared. Oh, there we go. Do we have a different process for men and women, or is it the same? Our model and process is adaptable, that we work. We might be looking at, if we've got a female offender or a person that's done harm, we'll be looking very carefully at the mix of our team and who's got the expertise to work with a minority group and whatever minority it is. So the process itself works well and is adaptable to whatever comes our way, which is really great.
And I wondered if you want to carry on as you started. There's another question around just wondering what you would consider safe in the way to contact survivors. So Tony mentioned the difficulty of finding sometimes safe ways to contact survivors in the situation where the person who has done harm is the one who wants to start the process. I thought that was quite an important question too. Yes,
and that's a really difficult one because what we know, of course, in the sexual violence sector is that if anybody contacts a survivor before they're ready to be dealing with this, it can be quite re-traumatizing and triggering, and trigger off a whole series of mental health issues. So we think very carefully when we get a referral from somebody that has done the harm as to how we might do that, and if there's no safe way to do that, then we will say to the person that's done the harm, you just need to wait until that person is ready to come forward. There's various avenues that we've looked at. If the person's in custody, then we have the victim notification register and the parole board as a possible way of letting that person, the survivor, know that the harm doer has made an invitation for restorative justice, and that's very carefully navigated between the survivor specialist and the victim notification register person that is informing victims of anything that's happening with the prisoner. If it's a family situation, is there somebody within the family so we may have a father, brother, uncle, whoever that's come forward and said, I need to apologise. And then we'll be looking, is there an ally to the survivor? Does the survivor know that that person's come to us? And if they don't, is there a safe way of getting to that person? And if there's not, again, we would say, well, sorry, it's great that you're wanting to take responsibility, and we just need to let it be for the minute. So there's a lot of assessment work done to try and figure that out.
I'd just like to say that a lot of the questions that have come through may be able to be answered in the next 2 sessions, so we'll take note of them and make sure that they're answered in the appropriate session. But people can always contact us if they have very specific questions that they want and would like more information on.
I'm just wondering, Jennifer, if you'd like to bring up the last slide so we can actually have your contact details if people do want to contact you.
Here we go.
In sessions. So there's information directly for Project Restore, which is the main website, and you can also contact us if you have any questions specifically around signing up for webinars and all the technical details around that. So I have copied all of the questions for you so that none of them will go lost, and you as presenters can actually have a look at them afterwards and see which other ones you might want to bring up in the next sessions and weave them in through your presentations. So if that feels like where we're landing right now, firstly, I want to say thank you for sharing your wisdom, and thank you for this really innovative process and cutting edge process in changing the way we work around holding accountability and restoring well-being and healing for those who've been harmed. It's I'm very excited to have learnt more. I've heard about you for a long time, and just to answer one of the questions that I know came up, you are nationwide, I believe. So you cover the whole of the North and South Island, and that as an opportunity for everyone to be able to engage with is so exciting. And so thank you for all your work. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for running not just one webinar but 3. It feels like a huge privilege for all of us to be able to learn from you. So thank you. Tony, did you want to close us off? Can
I just add before we do, just briefly, that we operate under a set of standards, Ministry of Justice standards, and we're accredited. So we are the only organisation doing restorative justice for sexual violence that is accredited and contracted by the Ministry of Justice to do the work that we do. Yeah. Sorry, Tony.
Yep. Kia tau, kia tata katoa, te ata whai o tātou rīkui, karaiti me te araha o te whiwhinga, ki te wairua tapu, aki. Ameni. Thanks for listening.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you.